A Spectator subscription is now better value than ever before. As a new subscriber joining today, you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. To subscribe today, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, Rishi Sunak, welcome to the offices of The Spectator.
Thanks for having me.
The morning after the night before, exciting debate last night. Just a preliminary, because you mentioned it first in the debate last night. David Trimble died, and you paid tribute to him. Almost the last thing David Trimble intervened on, I think the last in public life, was on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And he was very worried about it because he said that it threatened the peace process. It's threatened the Belfast Agreement. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think where I agree with David is we must preserve the Union. And as I said last night, he was someone who did an enormous amount to support the Union, bring peace to Northern Ireland, and we'll miss him dearly for that. And what I've seen in the job that I've had is certainly economically, the patterns of trade have changed in a way that moves Northern Ireland further away from the orbit of the rest of the United Kingdom, and that's not something that I want to see continue. And I think there are some very real challenges with the arrangements that are in place currently. I'd like to see those fixed, and that's why I think the protocol bill gives us an opportunity to do that. But the door should always be there for a negotiated settlement with Europe, not least because it is a lot faster. It will take time for that legislation to get through all its stages in Parliament. And as Prime Minister or whoever the new leader is, I think there will be an opportunity to, again, talk to our Irish and European friends and see if we can find a solution that is in everyone's interests.
So you think your opponent's line on this is a bit hyper, and you don't worry about the political dangers in Northern Ireland?
I mean, I do worry about the impact that the protocol is having on the ground, absolutely, and I see that from businesses, I see that from disrupted trade flows, and that speaks to a broader thing. It's not just about the fact that trade is being disrupted. We care about the territorial integrity. I care about the territorial integrity of our United Kingdom, and if we've got a set of processes in place currently that are undermining that, then I don't think that's something that any UK Prime Minister could accept. And I would want to find ways to correct that. The bill gives us the opportunity to correct those. It will take time to get through Parliament, so if there's an opportunity for a negotiated settlement, I think any Prime Minister, of course, should look at that, not least because it could be far quicker resolution to those issues. But I think we must be clear that there is genuine forces here that are undermining the Union, and it's right that we look at them and address them and fix them.
Thank you. Let's go to the debate more widely. I don't want to spend all the time talking about the debate, but it's a good focus for where we've got to in this. Why was the jolly well was different last night, and why is there no more Mr. Nice Guy? Why has it all changed like that?
Well, half the time people are saying to me, "Well, we're not sure if you can be tough enough, if you're tough enough to be Prime Minister," and then when you are tough, it's "Oh gosh, you're too tough." No, we don't like that. No, I think these ideas really matter to me, and I'm saying the things that I believe are in the best interest of our country. I'm in this because I believe in public service, and I've deliberately chosen to say some things that probably aren't that easy. They're certainly not doing me any favours, as you can see, but I firmly, passionately believe that the right things for our country, and that's why I'm going to keep saying them, and I'm going to keep talking about them passionately, and I think it's right that everyone engages with these questions, and I'm sure we're going to get into it now.
We are, but the word, it wasn't invented solely by Liz Truss's people. I got a text from a friend who was watching saying he's mansplaining. What do you say to that?
I think these are just vigorous debates on policy, and I think it's right that each of us are held to account by the other for the things that we're saying, and that proper scrutiny is brought to bear on those. I'm passionate about these things because I'm genuinely worried about the potential direction of travel for the country if we do things that will damage people's livelihoods, push up mortgage rates, and I care deeply about that. So even if it's not going to be easy for me, I want to have that debate, and I'm going to make sure that we...
But I thought we liked you because you were such a scrupulously polite person, and you were a little bit rude last night, weren't you?
I don't think I was rude. I was just making sure that the points that needed to be debated were heard.
Very good.
And I've got nothing but enormous personal affection and regard for Liz, as I think everybody knows, and we've worked together for a long time. And this is not about her as a person or me as a person. This is about the ideas that we're trying to debate.
On that, actually, and you both sort of brought that quite pleasantly together at the end in the debate. But do you regret that the form of all of this, so that you are sort of invited to attack one another in public?
Yes, I do.
So would you do it differently?
Well, I think it's very well. It's fundamentally quite hard. I mean, it's a hard thing to reconcile if you want to have a debate with two people head to head on live TV. It's unfortunately going to accentuate the differences. Yeah. The format, that's what the format is designed to do, and there's a balance to be struck by making sure that the process is accountable to the general public, because we're also picking a prime minister, but having a process that actually reminds everyone we're all on the same team here, we're all Conservatives, as I was at pains to point out last night, we're all in the same family and we'll come together after this to serve the British people. And there's a debate to be had about what's the right way to provide that scrutiny and accountability, but also do so in a way that is supportive of our Conservative family. I think there's probably a question to be had about that. Yes. Because I think at this point we're having more election debates than we've had in the general election campaign. we're only a week into it.
Yes, I mean, in your Mace lecture this year, you praised Paul Roma at I think he's a Stanford professor, isn't he?
He is. Well, he was when I was there. He taught me.
Yes, for the concept of non-rivalrous ideas. It wasn't much showing of that last night, was there?
No, this is the thing. It's great that you read the lecture, so thank you, Charles. No, so he was my professor at Stanford, and he's won a Nobel Prize for economics, and what was inspiring about him was he talked about where does growth come from in a modern economy. Yes. And actually, this is the problem with these debates, is they're actually on an incredibly narrow set of topics. Yeah. And that's actually something I'm sad about. We didn't really get a chance to talk about growth very much last night. You read my lecture, which is good of you, but that is a very detailed, thoughtful, I would say, view of how to drive growth in a 21st century economy. And I set out my view on that, and it's based on my values as a Conservative and a belief in free enterprise as the best way to drive that growth. But it's also based on my experience in business and my understanding of the very real challenges that we face. And Paul Romer's idea was about innovation. Yes. And actually, in a 21st century economy, the most important way to drive growth is by having an economy that is able to create new ideas and then spread them across the rest of the economy. And it's something that we used to be very good at. We're still pretty good at it, but we need to make sure that we're the best place in the world for it. And my particular experience in business, living and working internationally, means that I believe I'm the best placed person to lead us into the future and do all the things that are necessary to drive growth in the 21st century, which is about far more than tax cuts and the tax system. There's so many other things we need to get right. Access to talent, making sure businesses have the capital they need, making sure our education system is fit for the future. We didn't talk about any of that last night, which is sad.
No, but you could have, but you chose, I think it quite often happens in political debates that both of you make a big thing of something that actually probably isn't a first order question. And that's, I think, in a way what you've just been saying. So there is a difference between you and Liz Truss about tax cuts, but actually that's not the big thing, is it?
Well, and even on that, I'm not, I think the difference is probably accentuated because it makes for good TV. I'm a Conservative. I believe in tax cuts. I believe in a lower tax economy. I think anyone who's read anything I've ever written or heard any of my speeches that I've given can see that. And of course I'm going to deliver tax cuts. And I actually set out earlier this year, I stood at the dispatch box and held up a big document that said tax plan on it with the direction of travel for where we're going to take business taxes and personal taxes. Now, I know no one's particularly focused on that now, but those are the things I believe, and that's what I deliver as Prime Minister. I think there is a difference between us because I think there is enormous risk right now in launching on a huge spree of borrowing-funded tax cuts that obviously don't pay for themselves. So really, we are putting that on the country's credit card to the tune of tens of billions of pounds. I don't think that's right morally, but I also think that runs the risk of entrenching inflation for longer and driving up interest rates. That was what I was pointing out last night. That is a difference. People will have their own view on that. I've made my point of view clear on that. But as I said, last night we didn't talk about the NHS. We didn't talk about how to grapple the backlogs, which is actually one of the most pressing public service priorities. We didn't talk about education, and actually our children's education today is our economy tomorrow. We didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about how to tackle illegal migration. I set out a very detailed 10-point plan. I put out a video which I'd urge all Spectator viewers and readers, if you've got 5 minutes, go on my website, find that video so you'll hear from me about immigration.
There's your advertisement, readers.
Well, there you go. But I think that those are all really pressing issues as well, and we didn't cover any of them now. I think in the probably whatever 3 or 4 debates that we've had, which is right. I think sad for everybody.
So that being so, despite the strong disagreement, if you win, you'd be perfectly happy to make Liz Truss your Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Well, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to sit here and start talking about...
I'm not saying you have to, I'm just saying you'd be happy
But as you heard from me last night, I mean, again, I've got an enormous amount of warmth and affection for Liz, and when I first came to Parliament, I was part of a group of MPs that all worked on very similar policies together with Liz, and we served in Cabinet together. We do disagree on this, and that's fair enough. And as I said, I've made my point, she'll make her point, people will make up their own mind. But it would be nice to talk about some of these other things as in the course of the debates. But with regard to her and actually all the other leadership candidates, whether it's Kemi or all the others, what you saw was, gosh, there's an enormous amount of quality and talent at the top of the Conservative Party. And, part of being a leader is bringing the party back together. I certainly would draw on all the talents and traditions that our parliamentary party has to build a team of the best and the brightest and make sure that everyone feels their point of view is represented somewhere in government. The challenges that our country faces at the moment are too great not to put our best team forward, and you saw a lot of it on display in this leadership debate. When you...
Now, here is something in the economic debate which you sort of did have, but you had it in quite a rough way. And it's both important technically, economically, and it's important politically, and it really centres on interest rates. You had a big go at Patrick Minford, though you didn't name him, and you quoted him, he thinks in the Times today rather unfairly, on what he really thinks about interest rates and what they should be and so on. But surely the fundamental issue here is important, and maybe Minford and maybe Liz Truss are right if this is what they're saying, that low interest rates have actually been very damaging for the Western world, and that it's been a sort of government and central bankers working together in a way that has stopped the growth of real wages, inflated assets, misdirected capital, and is really caused inflation, is really one of the big problems of our time. And actually we need higher interest rates. Obviously there's an important debate about how fast they should go, but we do need them, don't we? Do you agree with that sort of causation?
Well, no, but if that is the view, then all I'm saying is that we should just be honest about that.
Right, but what is your view?
Well, my view is I worry about the impact of significantly higher interest rates that would be caused by a government borrowing tens of billions of pounds at a time when we already have an inflation problem, because I think unnecessarily making them even higher would be very damaging for millions of British families, people with mortgages, businesses that are using loans to grow their businesses. And your point of view, not your point of view, but that point of view may well be entirely reasonable, but then it should be then put on the table. And if you're going to say, I'm going to go and borrow lots of money and I'm going to do all these things, that will mean higher interest rates. That person might think that's a good thing, but at least they should be honest about that, so then people can make up their mind as to whether they think that combination actually is better for them. And as I said, I think the risk, and it wasn't me that said this, it was Patrick Minford, who was the person that Liz quoted as the economist who was supportive of her plan, who mentioned the 7% interest rate. It wasn't me, it was him, and people should know what that means. That means probably about £6,000 on a typical mortgage.
Well, he didn't say. He was talking about what might ultimately be quite a good state of affairs in which you have 2% inflation.
But he did say that interest rates, when asked about the plan and doing extra borrowing now, he did very clearly say interest rates would need to rise.
Yes.
And he very clearly gave some numbers.
But they will need, they are rising. And they do need to rise.
Well,
the
question
You're not
is,
attacking the fact they're rising.
Of course they're rising. I support a central bank acting as I've told them to act, forcefully to control inflation. So, and that's what I did as Chancellor. There's a question about doing things that make their job even harder,
yes,
and make the situation even worse. And beyond that, it's if inflation gets entrenched in the system, then what you need to do to get it out again is very damaging.
Yes.
And we've lived through that as a country in the past. And I know, there's now a generation of people who have not lived through that, myself included. I was born in 1980. It's not as if I've lived experience as an adult of it.
Sure.
Obviously I've studied economics, so I understand it, but there'll be lots of people who remember what that was actually like.
Yes.
And
One here.
right. And the inflation genie, when it gets out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back. That really is true.
But don't we have to drill this a bit harder, because one of the criticisms of you, it's to do with partly your own fault for being such an extremely able, well-educated person, is that you tend to express with great sort of clarity and moderation what is basically the orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy has gone wrong. And one of the big orthodoxies is all related to quantitative easing, the role of central banks, the role of interest rates, and how that's actually not increased the general prosperity, it's increased the prosperity of people with assets. And the reason we've got inflation, one of the reasons we got inflation is that there was yet more quantitative easing very recently, as well as what had happened before. And the central bank mandate that Liz Truss was questioning is problematic, isn't it? Because all it looks at is inflation. But actually, interest rates affect the economy rather than just reflecting it. And that's something one has to... So, for example, shouldn't the mandate include watching asset prices?
Look, I think I get this a lot, this question about orthodoxy. And it's interesting because the orthodoxy was actually, not that long ago, that interest rates would remain low for a long time. And inflation no one had to worry about.
Correct.
And we were entering a period of secular stagnation. That was the orthodoxy. That was indeed the orthodoxy in this country as well as in the US. And I was told by lots of people that it was okay. Borrowing was all right. You don't have to worry about that anymore because interest rates will be low forever. And that was not something I believed. I was one of the first people to say, no, I think that is wrong, that orthodoxy. I think it's misguided and it would be irresponsible of me as Chancellor to rely on that sustaining. And I actually said that, I said it earlier, and then I said it again in an interview with your magazine. And there's a great, there's a great front cover of The Spectator when I was doing an interview with Fraser and Kate about this, I think way back when, which was one of the first times someone had actually talked about it. So that was me railing against this orthodoxy at the time. So I think this idea that somehow I'm the author, I think is actually just not quite right. And actually, so I was the one who called this out as a risk.
So you said earlier in this interview that I told the bank to behave.
Because part of the job of Chancellor is to set the remit for the Bank of England, and part of my job is to do that, and I did that.
Are you dissatisfied with what the bank did?
No, my job is to give them the remit. Their job is to meet it. Now, they're not alone in grappling with high inflation. So us, Europe, the US, all of us have inflation running close to double digits, actually. But there were some particular things in the UK that I said I was worried about some months ago. One of them was inflation expectations. And actually that is a real challenge, because if people's expectations of future inflation start to rise, that's where you get all the challenges with wage price spirals. And you are starting to see that in the UK ahead of other countries. And that is something that I want to make sure that the Bank of England are cited on, which they are, and it's something that I mentioned in my conversations with the governor, and I know that they look at that, and that's what we need to guard against. And that's what government needs to guard against as well, because if government is going to do things that don't give people the confidence that inflation will actually come down, it then becomes a self-fulfilling situation where it doesn't come down because people are planning for it not to, and then demanding wage settlements that are higher, and then we end up in this problem lasting years and causing families enormous misery.
One thing you're very emphatic about is the importance of getting the public finances under control. But of course, if you're to do that, you will have to cut. because you've spent more than anyone else ever. Now, I'm sure you'll argue, perhaps rightly, that's no fault of your own on that, but but that is the fact of the case. So what are you going to cut?
So this is really important to me, and I'm right to use the word emphatic, and it's actually, we're talking, I would hope, to a largely conservative supporting audience. I actually find it really sad that I seem to be pushing what is considered a slightly minority opinion on this. I don't know how we've got ourselves into a situation where Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are now able to attack Conservative candidates as peddling the fantasy economics of unfunded promises. I mean, that's the language he's using, right? They're talking about the magic money tree, but they're talking about us. When it comes to the magic money tree. I mean, everyone just needs to take a pause and just think what has happened. Now, look, I was brought up with kind of kitchen table conservative values. You know, when I was doing my mum's accounts and her books in our house for her local chemist that she ran, that I worked in. And I do believe that you have to pay for the things that you spend money on. That's a kind of simple, basic moral tenet of conservatism. I care about what we leave our kids and our grandkids, and I just don't think it's right to rack up bills on the country's credit card and leave them to pass the tab. Yes, but then I'm also saying that we should pay for those and not just pass the buck on to them, right? But that now seems to be something that no one wants to face up to. I think that's really wrong, and I'm not really bothered if people don't like me saying it or it makes me unpopular. I deeply believe it to my core, and you know what? If we are not the party of sound money, I've said it before, like, what is the point in the Conservative Party? It's the most conservative of conservative values, and it's what I absolutely stand for.
So when you invoke Mrs. Thatcher, and you've done that, including rather charmingly photographically last weekend.
That was my wife. My wife was literally, she went slightly rogue. My wife, after that event, when I disappeared off to do whatever next campaign stop, because she was there with the kids, and she thought, well, she might as well go and take them to see the statue. So, which I didn't find out about till much later in the evening, but yes, there we go.
But so what's the essence of the connection between Rishi Sunak and Margaret Thatcher? Why does this matter in order to fight this battle today?
I'm not going to sit here and draw the comparisons, Charles, and you're obviously the expert, so I certainly wouldn't try and do it with you. But I just know how I was raised, and I was raised in the 80s. I was born in 1980, and I was raised, and it always felt. And we didn't talk politics at home. My parents didn't have time for that, right? They were just working day and night trying to make a better life for their 3 kids. But it was always the sense that if you wanted to work really hard and build that better life for your children, that was something that she supported, Mrs. Thatcher, right? It was that kind of middle-class aspiration that really struck a chord in my family. And I remember even later on when there were some privatisations and my dad was so excited, and it wasn't huge money, but to make sure that there was £100 worth of whatever privatised utility or whatever it was at the time. And I remember that was a big exciting thing when that happened in our house. So it was that sense of our values being aligned and of her supporting families like ours to get on and build a better life for themselves that really struck a chord. And then look, later as I studied and learned and everything else, this kind of kitchen table, as I described it, I that struck a chord with me. She talked about her upbringing in the grocer's shop and all this kind of house, the kind of approach to the household budget. That's how I was raised. And so those values, I think, are quite similar to mine in that sense. And look, on the policy side, again, look, you're going to know better than me, so I'm not going to second guess it. But
I'm interested in how you derive. Not trying to catch you out on her.
That's what spoke to me about it at the time. And look, was she, as you've seen her, you've heard from a bunch of people in her cabinet, whether that's Lord Howard or Lord Lamont and all these others, and Peter Lilly. And I'm so humbled to have the support of people like that for the approach I'm taking, because they were there with her.
Yes.
And yes, we all remember those unbelievable tax-cutting budgets that Nigel Lawson delivered. And gosh, that was inspiring to me. And his memo on tax reform that is in his biography, I go and reread because it's brilliant. And I spoke to him about it when I had the privilege of meeting him. But we have to also remember what Geoffrey Howe and her did at the beginning.
Yes.
And I quoted some of that in my May's lecture.
Indeed.
And there were some real challenges that the country faces. And she did things that she didn't love doing, and she talked about it in her memoirs, but she knew they were the right things to do for the country. And then that set the conditions for them to deliver all the radicalism. And I just want to do the same.
Yes. And here there's a difficulty, isn't there? Because it sounds ridiculous to talk about her as having had some easy wins, because actually it was really difficult. But there were some things she could do which you can't, because she's already done them. So she got rid of the Price Commission, she got rid of exchange controls, she did the trade union reform, she did privatisation, and all of those things, and many others, top rate tax and things, changed the situation.
They did.
Now, what can you do?
What's the equivalent?
Because people are worried that they know your heart's in the right place, and they know you've got a very good head, but they can't quite see the path.
Yeah. So this is the thing. What is the equivalent supply side radicalism for a 21st century economy?
Yeah.
Right. And I've thought long and hard about this, and we don't have those things. You can't go and privatise things to the same degree. Look, can we be tougher on the unions? Of course we can, and we should legislate to make sure that they have to have minimum service standards and things. But the top rates of tax are not all 80 or 90% anymore. And that's what I was saying before. Growth in the 21st century is about different things now, right? So the supply side radicalism that I want to bring is making sure that this is the most productive, innovative economy in the world. So that means making sure that businesses invest, because for far too long businesses have not invested enough. So the tax cuts we need that I'm proposing, that I talked about in that lecture, were about tax cuts on business investment. Because if you want to look at where we're not competitive, it's there. And if businesses don't invest in equipment, in manufacturing, in production, in robotics, we won't be able to create better paid jobs of the future. The supply side activism we need is on regulation. In financial services post-Brexit, there's tons that we can reform, and I was about to introduce a bill as Chancellor that's a Big Bang 2.0, as I've described it in the past. And that will unlock capital from our pension funds and our insurance industry to drive growing companies. We need regulation reform on clinical trials, because life sciences is one of the growth industries of the future, on how we use data, on our migration regime to make sure that the best and the brightest from around the world come and study and invent and create companies here. That we need free ports, which I'm delivering as a post-Brexit opportunity to bring jobs and investment to places like Teesside or Southampton, where I grew up, or Humberside. Those are all supply-side radicalism for the 21st century. They look different to what she did, but people should be in no doubt that is the kind of radical change that I want to bring. It looks different, but it's what is required in a 21st century economy.
They are important, and they would have real effects on real people, but compared with the Thatcher era, they are relatively technocratic. So people used to say, I remember sort of taxi drivers and people saying things like to me like, Maggie Thatcher got me my house.
Right.
Now, what are they going to say about what did Rishi Sunak do that was like that?
Well, if you walk around Teesside, I'd like to think they'd say, well, Rishi Sunak helped get me my job. Because I've got a job down the Freeport, and I work in the vaccine manufacturing plant that has opened there, or this new offshore wind facility that GE have come and invested in, and that all happened because he created this Freeport here, and that brought optimism and hope to us here. But the thing that really should resonate with people is education. And that is the tangible thing. There's nothing technocratic about it. It's a thing that I'm most passionate about. And my parents, they worked day and night, they saved and they sacrificed because they believe education was the path to a better future for their children. It's an entirely conservative way of looking at the world. It's how I look at the world. And I remember in my selection meeting, when they were asking me what job I wanted, I talked about the reforms that Michael Gove had ushered in, and how I had nothing but admiration for that, and it was inspiring to me, and I wanted to try and do something like that one day if I was fortunate enough. And that's what we should be doing.
Do you see a particular thing to be done there?
I think there's lots that we can do, because I think we've lost, and part of the criticism may be a strong word, but we had to deal with COVID. I think we focused over the last few years as a government a lot on how can we put more money into public services, and that's all good and well. We should be focused far more as Conservatives about what we get out of public services. Yeah. How are we transforming people's lives? What are the reforms we're doing? Which vested interests are we taking on? That's what Michael did. He didn't have lots of extra money. He delivered all those reforms.
So can you do this in relation to universities or schools?
What you can do in schools. So in schools, there's lots we can do. When I was working abroad, I volunteered with an educational charity that worked with some of the toughest state schools pretty much anywhere in the world, and we introduced technology in a radical way into those schools, and it was brilliant. The children's learning improved. Teachers' workload was freed up entirely. They could focus on what they loved doing, which was more personalised learning for smaller groups of students at a time. And the kids were far more motivated and engaged as a result. And we did that in some of the most deprived areas that we were working in. So there's one simple answer.
Is this in the United States?
This is in the States, yeah, where I was doing that. But we can bring that same kind of radical thinking here as well. But curriculum is another area we need to look at. And I think, again, in a 21st century economy, I think it's worth us looking at, have we got the balance right between what we are doing at 16 and 18, and actually should we be looking at things like baccalaureates and other things where we can have no relaxation in our standards, but a broader set of subjects that prepare students for the 21st century economy. And then we also need to double down on teachers. Mm-hmm. Now, I come from a culture which absolutely reveres teachers, and teaching is one of the noblest things that you can do. And that's what we need to make a reality. We need to get the best teachers in the world here. We need to give them the support they need, the training they need, so that they can fulfill their potential, because that's what has the biggest impact on kids. Now, in doing all the things I just mentioned, there will be lots, like Michael had, there will be lots of vested interests that rail against all of those. But as he showed, when we take on those things as Conservatives, challenge convention, push through good reforms, our children will benefit. And that's the type of very tangible thing that we should and can be doing.
One of the difficulties of this whole campaign is that there are these ambitions like that, which are very important, but there's such enormous immediate problems. And one of them is energy prices. And this really does bring into question net zero, doesn't it? Because it's one thing to say that you're very worried about climate change, and you say that and you explain some remedies. But net zero, as opposed to the question of climate change, is essentially an arbitrary target invented by sort of international agreement. The world isn't going to change because something happens by 2050, particularly. I mean, do you see what I mean? And yet, people are now really, really squeezed on this, and they're really, it's one of the major factors that's costing them a lot more money and also causing insecurity of supply. You must be worried about that, aren't you?
Well, I'm worried about the anxiety that people are feeling right now with energy bills. Of course I am. I saw that as
But specifically on the effect of why are we all chasing this thing when we've got this very urgent problem?
Well, so I think we absolutely need to deal with the urgent problem, right? And I said previously, of course, net zero is important. I think it's worth pointing out that at this point, I think 80 or maybe even 90% of the world's GDP is covered by a net zero target at this point.
Not fulfilled.
No, but no one has fulfilled them today, right? Yeah. These are all targets that are happening in the future. And I've said very clearly that we shouldn't run at that target so hard and so fast that we do enormous damage to people and the country along the way. And by the way, we will then lose people. Yeah. We will then lose people, and actually people will not want to do it at all. So we've got to do it in a measured way, and do it in a way that means that we're keeping pace, but we don't have to be the one out in front necessarily. So that's been my approach to it. The urgency of our problem now, you're right to highlight, because it's having a very real impact on people. I don't think you can blame that all on net zero. Let's be clear. It's Russia started a war, and we've decided to take some action against that, and that's having an impact on energy prices. Yeah. So people absolutely need support in the short term to help get them through it. But I think they're also asking the question, well, what is your long-term solution here? I've said that I'll have an energy security target. So you've asked me about a net zero target. We should also have an energy security target, which I've said we will do before 2050, which means that we are energy independent with energy, whether that's more offshore wind, nuclear, or new sources. We need to do that. But it should be an equal level of commitment. And in the short term, the things that we can do that will make a difference on both are things like energy efficiency,
and fossil fuels that you because of the intermittency problem that we need more.
I was, I think, the first cabinet minister to to actually, again, you talk about challenging orthodoxy and everything else. I think I was the first cabinet minister to go out and make a very positive statement of support for the North Sea oil and gas industry. Yeah. And I did that much earlier in this year.
But you want the levies to stay. You don't agree with Liz's thing of suspending the green levies?
I think, look, this is just comes down to borrowing, right? So that all those levies pay for something. Mm-hmm. So you can't magic away the payments. Yeah. Government has contractual obligations on all of those things. Yeah. So if someone is saying, well, we're just going to not do them, what they're saying is we're just going to borrow more, right? I mean, you can't cancel the contracts. I think so. Those contracts are paying for things that benefit people today. Yeah. And so you can perfectly well say, well, we'll just borrow instead and not have people pay for them. But
can I go back? I thought I'd better have another look at your resignation letter. And because, there's ill excitement, it's all rather forgotten. And I actually don't understand why you resigned. It doesn't say, really. And when you say, so what's the answer to that? And Boris's letter also doesn't mention any disagreement. So I'm sort of slightly perplexed.
Okay, well, I'm not as good a writer as you, Charles, so I apologise. I hope I don't ever have to do that again, but next time I know, I'll maybe get some tips. So there were two reasons, really, which I thought came out in the letter, or at least tried to. The first was about the conduct of government, and obviously everyone will recall the most recent in a long line of incidents where trust was called into question, and that was over the Chris Princher thing. Now, I've always tried to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt on these things when these things have come up in the past, but it got to a point where enough was enough for me. And
enough what?
Enough was enough on questions of trust, right, and honesty about how we were dealing with
So he was lying?
Well, it's unclear because exactly what happened, but it was clear to me that what was said was not accurately reflective of what seemed to have happened.
So he wasn't telling the truth?
Well, he would say what his spokesman said and da-da-da-da-da, but at the end of the day, look, I resigned, right? Yeah. So you can tell I wasn't comfortable with it and I didn't want to defend it. So there's no point me pretending otherwise. I didn't think how that situation played out was appropriate. Yeah. And that's why I resigned. But the other proximate reason was he and I were due to give a speech about the economy and the direction of travel, and we were clearly on very different pages, as you can see in this leadership election.
And so that's on tax.
It's not just about tax. It was about, again, it comes back to being honest with the country about the challenges we face, about how we grapple with them, the responsible approach to dealing with them, and clearly
So what's the key truth? One thing you did say in the letter, which I said you didn't understand, is that the public are ready to hear the truth. What is the key truth?
I think you've heard it in this leadership election. On the economy, I am prepared to say some things that have not made my life easy. I'm prepared to tell people that you can't have your cake and eat it.
Yes.
Right. You can't actually.
Yes. So that demolishes Borisism.
And we're seeing some of that. Look, there's lots of people who think you can continue to do that. Right. I think I would argue that thinking that you can borrow, I think at last count, £40 billion, not do anything on public spending, and that will have no impact on inflation or interest rates, it feels to me a little bit like cakeism as well. Yes. I don't think that's leadership. I think leadership is about being honest. It's about acknowledging the trade-offs involved in these very difficult things and being upfront about that, and then being responsible in how you deal with them. And part of the reason we're in the mess we're in over the past 2 years, there has been too much of that.
Yes,
and we need to get away from that. And that's the type of change in leadership that I will bring as Prime Minister.
But you were the Chancellor, so you ultimately decide financial matters. I know Boris would say, as Prime Ministers do from time to time, I'm the First Lord of the Treasury. But as far as
the Prime Minister decides, the Prime Minister decides. Right, like the Prime Minister.
It's your budget, for example.
It's my budget, but the Prime Minister has to sign off on the budget. The Prime Minister, right at the end of the day, that's how it works. And I think this has evolved over the years, but ultimately the Prime Minister decides as well. I'm obviously going to give him my view on what we should do and the best advice that I can. And clearly, as you could see, that's partly why I resigned, because it doesn't work if the Prime Minister and Chancellor are not very much on the same page
Yes.
on the economy and the direction of travel, particularly when things are going to be challenging.
Yeah.
And that's why I had to go at the end of the day.
But
We're about to go for a difficult
and actually,
period.
this had gone on quite a lot before, and you'd been pretty. I mean, did you quite seriously think of resigning before that quite often?
Look, I'm instinctively a loyal person, and I had an enormous gratitude to the PM for giving me this job. And I'd like to think I did a good job in it, and had to do a budget in record time after being appointed, help get the country through coronavirus. And I'm proud of the things that I achieved in the job working with him. And I always wanted to try and support him and recognise and respect the fact that he is a Prime Minister that won a very significant majority. And, if he stood on the steps of Downing Street and said that he wanted to fix and reform social care, if he wanted to deliver 50,000 nurses and 40 new hospitals and 20,000 more police officers and level up across the country, that those commitments should be delivered. And, my job was to make that work. And I tried to do that for as long as I could.
But you say you talk about loyalty, but well, I'm a bit puzzled by the whole thing. When Geoffrey Howe resigned, his resignation letter made it absolutely clear it was all about Europe. We're now in an odd situation in which we're asked to believe that you're the sort of great, decent, honourable person, but also you're the one who stabbed the Prime Minister. And so people have rather conflicted views about it. And this is particularly true of Tory voters, I think.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that. And when I resigned, as I said in that letter, I resigned knowing it may well be the last job I ever had in government.
Yeah. And
I'm comfortable with that. I resigned on principle, and principles matter to me. And if that means that this doesn't work out for me, so be it. And I will always sleep soundly at night knowing that, for me, resigning was the right thing to do, because I couldn't condone the conduct of government at that moment, and I couldn't take part in an economic strategy that I didn't agree with. So I was left with no choice but to act on my principles. And I did the same in the past with Brexit. I would do the same again as Prime Minister, because principles matter to me.
However, you had made provision that it wasn't very likely you'd be straight out in the wilderness, because nothing was better organised than your machine to go for as the moment you resigned.
I actually enormous tribute to them, because we've been always focused on this video, and I can honestly say, hand on heart, that was put together in 24 hours. And I get a lot of criticism when people say, oh gosh, it's all very slick and professional and all this. I think professional is a good thing. I think being professional at things is something that we should celebrate, and actually we need more of it. And if we want to compete in the 21st century, then yes, we do need people to be professional and ambitious and strive to be the best at what they do. I'm going to apologise for that. And I'm really lucky I've got some people who are brilliant at that. And that was put together in a day. It's why? Because it was quite simple. I was just telling the story about my family and where I grew up and my values, and that's why I want to be Prime Minister, because this country did something incredible for my family by welcoming them here as immigrants 60 years ago. They allowed my parents to build a life for us. I worked in my mum's shop, as I said. My dad was an HSGP. We were brought up with values of hard work and public service and family. And it's because of their sacrifice and kindness and commitment that I had the opportunities that I had. And as Prime Minister, I want everyone's kids and grandkids to have those same opportunities. That's a pretty simple story to tell. And that's why it was possible to do it quickly. And all they did was, I didn't even know, they called my parents, they got some photos. The first time I saw it was a minute before it went out, and that was it. I was actually looking forward to a nice holiday for the first time in 3 years.
By his own account, Dominic Cummings had long ago conceived the idea that you should replace Boris. Indeed, he seemed to have thought of it when you went into the Treasury in the first place.
Well, look, that would be a question for Dominic Cummings to answer. For my part, again, this is something that people will put about, which is fine. I haven't spoken to Dominic Cummings or communicated with him in any way, shape or form since the day he left Downing Street. That was almost now coming up on 2 years ago. But the fact that people still want to put this about, I mean, fair enough. If they want to try and throw some mud my way, that's okay. I haven't spoken to him for almost 2 years. He wouldn't have anything to do with any Downing Street operation that I was fortunate enough to run, and there's not much more I can say about it than that.
Thank you. You speak very strongly and movingly about your background and its importance. This gives you authority perhaps to talk about something that you don't actually talk about very much, but increasingly worries people, particularly I think Conservative supporters, which is everything coming under the slightly annoying word woke. So how do you approach that subject? So far I'd say that without ever saying woke things, you've slightly sidestepped the subject. Where would you tend to... Shouldn't you be saying more? It seems to have got more and more salience.
Well, as Chancellor, my main priority was focusing on the economy. Yeah. And you talked about Lawsy before. I actually deliberately strived as Chancellor not to talk about things that were outside of my brief, because every time I did, or even remotely did it, everyone would start saying, oh gosh, well, what does that mean? And does that mean you're interested in being leader one day? Right? So I actually deliberately went out of my way not to do it. And now it's painted as a criticism. Oh, we didn't hear enough from you on your views on education policy or crime or migration. But it was a deliberate choice on my part, because I didn't want to cause any trouble. But you're hearing from me now, and I mentioned my illegal migration video. Please, everyone watching, if you've got 5 minutes, go and have a look at it, and you'll see my 10-point plan. And I make the point in there that, it's not racist to talk about wanting to control our borders. And, I do talk passionately about the fact that this country did something amazing for my family. But my family and millions like them, they followed the rules. And they came here legally. And that's what we need. We need a system that allows for that. And when people are exploiting that and breaking the rules, we should be robust in defending. And so that's, for one example. On the broader thing, my view on this is simple. When it comes, let's talk about women's issues. You mentioned my wife. I have 2 young daughters. And I think their rights are important. I mean, of course, I know what a woman is. I'm married to one, and I'm going to be very robust about defending women's rights, whether it comes to language or changing rooms or sports or all those types of things. And of course, I fully respect people's their right to live how they want, to love who they want. But women's rights are also important, and I will robustly defend them.
Do you think? I mean, many people would say. And the person who said it eloquently in this contest was Kemi Badenoch.
Kemi, yes.
That there's a sort of threat to civilization, Western civilization here in wokery. Do you agree with that?
I thought what Kemi did brilliantly, actually, in the debates is she linked this kind of woke agenda, which we're all familiar with, and made the argument, I think, very forcefully and well, that we shouldn't just view that force as being narrowly confined to some of these cultural issues. Actually, as conservatives who believe in a smaller state and a thriving civic society, we should view that same agenda as a threat to all of those things. It's much broader than the kind of the definition of what a woman is over here. It's that same force that has actually got a very different conception of the role between the state and the individual. And I think Kemi made that point, I think, articulately and well. And it's we should realise as conservatives, there's a much broader fight that we've got here on our hands. And look, and I'm someone instinctively, I'm not going to cross the road to start a culture war, but I'm someone who will robustly defend our values and institutions when they are under attack. And that's the approach I would take. But Kemi, made the excellent point that it's not just these narrow issues, it's much more pervasive. And if you think, when I talked about kids and education, I'm really, I want to make sure that what our kids are being exposed to in schools accords with our values. And I come and approach that first and foremost as a parent.
Part of those depend on how you understand British history. And as someone of Indian heritage, what would you say about the historical role of Britain in India? How do you regard that?
Yeah, look, it's funny. I'm married also to an Indian citizen, and my in-laws are Indian citizens as opposed to British Indian like me. And I'm not one of these people who thinks that we should erase our history and not be proud of it. Right? No country's history is free of blemishes. Of course, that's right. But there's an enormous amount in our history to be proud of, and we have to accept along the way the things that were not perfect as well. We shouldn't try and erase that. We shouldn't try and focus only on that as well.
Specifically in relation to India, what do you think of the British story?
Well, look, the British story everyone knows, right? And there were many things that were done that were, that may well have ended up being beneficial, not least language and other things. But of course, there were episodes in it that were appalling. And you don't need me to say that. Winston Churchill said that when you talk about things like the Amritsar massacre. No one can say that was not anything other than absolutely appalling. As Parliament at the time had commissions and talked about it, and rightly people should be were at the time held to account about it. So of course, as a British Indian, I'm going to feel that type of stuff acutely. But I'm very proud of our history as a country, enormously proud of it. This country welcomed me and my family here, and they chose to come here. Yes. And I think that's what's different. If you're an immigrant, if you remember, my family chose Britain because Britain was this unbelievably special place that represented a set of values and ideals that appealed to them about fairness, about opportunity, about a country where if you worked hard, put in and integrated, you could build a better life for yourself. And that's what Britain means to me. And you talk about India now, we've got to look forward, right? Yeah. So this goes back to supply side reform and growth. We need to make sure that actually are our students, or both of us, studying in each other's universities? Because there's as much that we can learn there as we can attract Indian students here. Are our companies developing products and services together? Is capital flowing between our economies? And we saw that on the vaccine, for example, an extraordinary collaboration between British and Indian research and manufacturing. That's what the future of that relationship looks like. And I gave a speech on this a few weeks ago. Yes. That's something that we should all be optimistic about.
I'm conscious of time, but but just one thing that flows on from that is, are you not the first generation of British politicians who face the fact that the West dominance is really under threat for the first time since the Second World War, or arguably for much, much longer than that, actually. This makes everything different. So, for example, in the case of Russia's attack on Ukraine, China is basically against us on this. And actually, India isn't really for us either. It sort of holds back. It's not very friendly to us about that. And lots of smaller states are not necessarily helping the West on this issue in international forums and so on. Do you think that we face a crisis in the West, which our leaders are not really facing up to, primarily, but not only because of the massive threat of China?
Yeah, so I think China is a significant threat to us, and I talked about it yesterday. It's a threat to our economic security and thereby our national security, and we need to be robust in defending ourselves against that. I think you're right. I think I think there is a complacency about this, and look, I've worked and lived around the world. And I mentioned it in the Mays lecture. Our ability to project power and influence and to make a difference in the world is in large part a function of the strength of our economy. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, if we want to fund the armed forces, if we want to make sure that we can make a difference in countries around the world, it all starts with having a very strong, vibrant, growing economy. Which is why getting that right is critical to all these things. Because there's only so much we can rely on history and nostalgia to project our power. We need actually raw power, and that comes first of all from economic strength. Now, the thing I see, and it goes back to the debate in this leadership election, is are we prepared to work at it or not? Right? Are we prepared to do what all these other countries are doing, which is have a time horizon that is far longer than ours? Yes. They are all prepared to sacrifice in the short term. Yeah. Because they want to do something that that advances their interests in the long term. They are prepared to sacrifice. They are prepared to work hard. You see all that in China. You see it in Russia, right? They prepared for this for a very long time, right? And we have to ask ourselves: are we prepared to do the same?
Can we look forward to Rishi Sunak Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, well, that's where our economic strength is important to making sure that we can counter initiatives like that, or that our military strength can be projected. But I think there's something more fundamental. We have to have the hunger. Like, we have no right to a seat at that top table. We have no right to project our force and our values, more importantly, across the world. We have to earn it. And the things that are worth having require hard work and sacrifice. But I tell you, they are sweeter as a result. But it's an entirely conservative value, I think, to sacrifice in the short term, as my family did, for a very different reason, to put in the hard work to build a better future. And if we want to meet these threats from countries like China, from Russia and others, we need to get ourselves into that mindset as a country. So these arguments that I'm making in a micro sense on taxing and borrowing can actually be expanded to a much larger thing. Are we prepared to earn the success that we need in order to succeed in the world? And that is a critical question, right? And it's not easy for people to hear that. And as leader, it's my responsibility to get our country in a position to do that.
Thank you. One very quick last question. You praise Mrs. Thatcher, but you probably don't like this quotation. particularly because you are up against a strong woman. And she said, the cocks may crow, but the hen lays the eggs. What do you? How do you react to that?
Well, you know what? I'm the dad, first and foremost, regardless of this job, I'm the dad of 2 young girls. So the more amazing female role models they have, the better. I think there was a lovely story. I can't remember if it was in your book or was it in one of hers, where she was visiting a school at some point, a primary school somewhere in the late 80s. And she was asking the kids, it was a boy, about, you know, what did he want to do when he grew up, and I can't remember what he said. And then she said, oh, do you not want to be Prime Minister? And he said, oh, can boys do that? Yeah. That's all he had done. And I thought that was brilliant. Right? So, you know, as a dad of 2 young girls, you know, as I said,
but this boy can do it. This boy can do it against a woman, right?
Oh, you're talking about me?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely I can. Yes, absolutely I can. And look, you've seen great female role models in this campaign, whether it's Kemi, whether it's Penny, whether it's Liz. But you know, I believe I'm the right person to do this job at this time. We have enormous challenges facing the country. You know, I will bring a different type of leadership, and it's leadership that will make sure that we are fit for the future. And I'm doing this motivated by a set of conservative values that I hold dear, that I am passionate about, that I was raised with because of what this country did for my family. That's what I will bring to this office, and we will deliver a conservative government that makes an enormous difference to people's lives.
Rishi Sunak, thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles.